Another rocket blasts off from the launch pad and heads for the International Space Station. To deliver the payload there, you'd have to pay about $18,000 per 1 pound of its weight. Imagine spending that much money on just 3 bananas. So, the weight of the rocket and spaceship itself is calculated literally down to every bolt and every ounce. But engineers normally use about 600 pounds of white paint to coat the rocket. That's $10,800,000. Let's see. You could buy a 3-masted schooner, a gold-plated Bugatti Veyron, or a penthouse in Manhattan, maybe 2 of them, for this money. Or perhaps even a private island. Well, a small one. But engineers have to paint rockets white so that they don't turn into flying ovens. Imagine sitting in a black car in a parking lot at noon in the summer. The air conditioning is off. You'll start feeling uncomfortable in a couple of minutes. But if your car is white, it will heat up more slowly. It's all about the reflectivity of the material. When the sun's rays touch a black surface, they get absorbed. As a result, everything under this surface heats up. But when the rays reach a white surface, they get reflected. This surface absorbs much less heat. That's why you feel much hotter wearing a black t-shirt in the summer than while putting on a white one. You also look hotter. But I digress. Spaceships fly in space, and the temperature there is about minus 455 degrees Fahrenheit. But space is also a vacuum. That means there's no air particles that can transfer heat up there, so nothing blocks the sun's rays and prevents them from heating up the surface of the rocket to insane temperatures. If the rocket was black, it would absorb all those rays, and astronauts would feel like a chicken in an oven. Besides heat, the sun emits radiation. Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere protect us from its destructive effect. But there's no such shield in space. So the white paint on the surface of spacecraft also protects astronauts from radiation. Spacesuits are white for the same reason. So is the International Space Station itself. On Earth, most airplanes are painted white. But even with white paint on the paneling, a spacecraft can heat up too much, and its other side, where the sun's rays don't reach, will cool down a lot. After all, space is very cold. So, engineers came up with a clever way to transfer the heat from the sunny side of the spaceship to its dark side. There are tubes under the paneling. They're filled with ammonia. The ammonia evaporates after absorbing the heat from the surface. Then it transports this heat to the colder side of the spaceship. There it gives off the heat and returns to its liquid form. After that, the ammonia moves back to the illuminated side of the spacecraft. The second reason why we paint spacecraft white is that space is black, and if you paint your spaceship black or any other color, you won't be able to see it. This will make it difficult to dock spaceships with each other or with the ISS. But a white spaceship is perfectly visible against the black background of space. The third reason is that you can see even the slightest damage on the spaceship if it's painted white. Long before launch, the spaceship is assembled in a hangar from dozens of different parts. Then it's delivered to the launch pad. And if something went wrong in that process, you will see any scratch or crack on the white surface. Or if any part is leaking, you'll quickly notice a stain on the white surface. But it's not just the surface of spaceships and the ISS that gets painted white. The interior is white too. If you look at photos of astronauts on the International Space Station, you'll see that most of the interior is either white or beige. Again, it's all about the reflectivity of this color. Electrical power is an important resource on the ISS. Every light bulb and LED must be used economically, and white surfaces effectively reflect the light from the bulbs all over the station. This way, it isn't dark there even without a lot of lighting devices. And this is the Saturn V, America's moon rocket from the 70s. It's the biggest, most powerful, and heaviest payload-carrying rocket ever made. And it's not completely white. Even more interestingly, its white parts are painted this way to provide protection from the scorching Florida sun on the launch pad. But you can also see black stripes all over the rocket's body. Thanks to them, cameras on the ground can determine its rotation speed. The point is that at launch, a rocket spins exactly like an arrow fired from a bow. This helps it to be more stable during the flight. When the rocket is launched and starts spinning, all video cameras are pointed at it. When experts watch the video of the launch, they analyze every frame. They pay attention to how the black stripes move. This way, they can calculate the rotation speed of the rocket. Now, let's take a look at the space shuttle. You can always recognize it by the huge orange tank attached to the spacecraft. It contained liquid oxygen and hydrogen to propel the space shuttle into orbit, and it was orange because it's covered with insulating foam. Oxygen and hydrogen can only be in a liquid state at extremely low temperatures and under high pressure. So engineers tried to protect the fuel from overheating with this insulation. But originally, this tank was white too. The reason was the same, to reflect the sun's rays. But later, engineers decided that the foam insulation would be enough and the paint layer was removed. So they managed to save about 600 pounds of weight and deliver more payload into space. And 600 pounds is almost 72 gallons of water or 900 large burgers. Wow, how did that get on board? Interestingly, the space shuttle itself wasn't completely white. It had a black bottom. That's to withstand the extreme heat of re-entering Earth's atmosphere. When the space shuttle completed its mission in space, it started to descend. At the height of, let's say, about 400,000 feet, it traveled at 25 times the speed of sound. When the space shuttle re-entered the atmosphere, it literally collided with air particles and began to break. At this point, its bottom heated up due to friction with the air. Try rubbing your palms together, they become warmer. The same happened to the bottom of the space shuttle, only it heats up to 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. By comparison, the temperature of a hot frying pan is about 6 times lower. Just touch it and see. Nah, don't. That's why engineers had to protect the bottom of the space shuttle from overheating with special black tiles. They're called HRSI, which stands for High Temperature Reusable Surface Insulation. Catchy. They're made of porous silicon, which means they're very light but can withstand extreme temperatures. But when it comes to new rockets, we won't have to worry about painting them white or protecting them with tiles. We'll build new rockets and spacecraft with stainless steel because it's easier, cheaper, and faster. Take the SpaceX Starship. This thing will be able to take people to the moon, and in the future, even to Mars. And it's made of stainless steel. 2 pounds of carbon fiber, which is used in conventional spacecraft, cost about $200. But the same amount of stainless steel costs about $3. And since the weight of the spacecraft and booster is about 300 tons, the difference is huge. Stainless steel does a good job of reflecting the sun's rays, too. Even though it's dark, it's shiny, so the ship won't overheat. In addition, stainless steel is great at withstanding low temperatures, so it won't deform in cold space. And to save Starship from overheating on re-entry, its paneling is designed like a sandwich. There's an outer layer of steel, then a layer of air, and an inner layer of steel. Kinda like an Oreo. The air acts as thermal insulation. So, Starship with people on board is attached to the booster on the launch pad. Ignition. The booster helps Starship escape Earth's gravity, then it undocks. At that point, Starship fires its engines and enters orbit. By this time, it has used up almost all its fuel. Meanwhile, the booster re-enters the atmosphere and makes a soft landing. It docks with a refueling ship. Ignition. The booster launches again, takes the spacecraft into orbit, and returns to Earth. The refueling ship docks with the Starship and replenishes its fuel supply. It also transfers cargo to Starship. Then it undocks and returns to Earth for its next mission. At the same time, Starship turns on its space travel engines and heads for its destination. The journey to Mars will take about 7 months. SpaceX also plans to use Starship for traveling on Earth. Launches can take place from water platforms near big cities. Then, the trip to the other side of our planet will take no more than 1 hour.
Picture this. You're an astronaut, hurtling through the cosmos in your state-of-the-art spaceship. But suddenly, you notice that you're running out of fuel. What are you going to do? Trapped in the middle of space. It's hardly like there's a floating gas station. The good news is that you're not going to get completely stuck. A spaceship will never actually stop after running out of fuel, all because there's basically no atmosphere in space. That's where the popular phrase, "in space, no one can hear you scream," comes from. Sound travels through the vibration of teeny tiny atoms and molecules. In space, where there is no air, there's simply no way for sound to travel. It's the same for our spaceship. Because there's no air, there's also a complete lack of air resistance. those tiny particles that do exist in space are way too small to reduce the spacecraft's momentum or drag it back. Because of this, most spacecraft actually turn their engines off for the biggest part of their journey. So, don't believe those movies that show spaceships with their engines on all the time. That's completely inaccurate. Unlike vessels in the water, a ship in space doesn't need constant thrust to keep moving forward. Usually, its engine is only fired up for short periods of time. This is not only practical, but also saves money. Fuel is really expensive to transport into space as it's heavy. That's why space probes try to use as little fuel as possible. They need it when they set off from Earth, and then again when they re-enter the atmosphere. It happens when they need to slow down upon their return. While cars and trains have brakes, it's not that simple to bring a spaceship to a screeching halt. The engines are needed to slow the ship down or bring it to a complete stop. This involves strategically firing up impressive thrusters at the front. It creates the needed drag and reduces the spaceship's speed. But this process also requires super high levels of precision. One wrong move and you're toast. Literally. Hit the thrusters too fast, and the spacecraft will set on fire as you re-enter Earth's atmosphere at thousands of miles per hour. Traveling too slowly can also cause problems, because in this case, you might miss our planet's orbit completely and move way past Earth. And most spacecraft don't have enough fuel to try for a second re-entry, so traveling too slowly needs to be avoided at all costs. But back to the issue at hand. This basically means that any vehicle with an empty tank will continue traveling at the same speed across space until it eventually runs into something. There's just no other way for it to stop. Wait, actually, maybe that's not good news. If you get stranded, it's pretty unlikely that your buddies over there at NASA are going to organize a rescue mission. This sounds kinda sad, but it does make sense. By the time they set up a new team and find a ship to come and rescue you, you'll have already traveled so far into space it would take them years to reach you. This would also cost a ridiculous amount of money. NASA spends on average a whopping $152 million to launch a ship into space. That's as much as buying 6 brand new top-of-the-range Lamborghinis. Even crazier, it cost NASA about $49 billion to develop and launch the first space shuttle. Unfortunately, once you've left Earth's orbit, it's near impossible that you'll make it back without fuel. That's what actually happened to NASA's Dawn spacecraft back in 2018. On a random day, the spaceship ran out of fuel. This left it completely stranded in the middle of space. It stopped transmitting signals to Earth, bringing an end to an 11-year-long mission that set loads of space records. The spacecraft could no longer generate electricity, as it had no fuel to move its solar panels to point them toward the sun. And to this day, the spaceship is still floating somewhere in space in a derelict state. Luckily, Dawn had no astronauts on board. The spacecraft began to orbit the dwarf planet Ceres, which was the object it was originally investigating. For context, an orbit is a curved path around a star, planet, or moon that an object gets stuck in. But wait, NASA are experts in all things relating to spacecraft. So how did they allow a ship to run out of fuel in the first place? It's actually super difficult to accurately measure the amount of fuel you'll need in space. On Earth, gravity keeps all the fuel at the bottom of the tank, and you can use a float sensor to measure how full the tank is. But this is impossible in space due to a lack of gravity that normally weighs the fuel down. Instead, a common approach is to add an air bladder into the fuel tank that's pressurized before launch to push the fuel into lines. The more fuel is used, the more this bladder expands. It takes up more space and keeps the fuel under the right amount of pressure. This pressure is monitored. That's how they can tell how much fuel is left. As you see, it's a lot more complicated than here on Earth. But say there were astronauts aboard a spacecraft that had run out of fuel. How long could they survive? Well, this depends on how much food and water is on board. NASA usually calculates the extra amount of food astronauts need for their trip to avoid adding extra weight to the spacecraft. But the good news is that this food can technically be rationed, and its consumption can be spread out. That's because astronaut food comes in special packaging to stop it from going bad. There are no refrigerators aboard spacecraft. The food comes in clear, flexible pouches that can be snipped open with scissors. All the food is pre-cooked and processed, so it doesn't need to be stored in a fridge. The only exceptions are fresh fruit and vegetables. These are the only things that need to be eaten quickly as they will spoil. Today, Astronauts also work with nutritionists so they can pick out the foods that they like and will enjoy eating. They can choose from a whole bunch of products, including mushroom soup, macaroni and cheese, chicken, beef, ham, nuts, and even yummy cookies. Shrimp cocktail is apparently a new favorite among astronauts because of how spicy it tastes. Flavored drinks also come in powdered form, just like the Kool-Aid or instant coffee packets you have sitting in your kitchen cupboard. Interestingly, astronauts often report not feeling hungry in space, so it may be easier than you'd think to ration the food. But even if you can make your food last, what about water? Transporting anything into space costs a lot, and water is quite heavy, so it costs even more to transport. For this reason, tanks of water can't be constantly shipped up to space. Instead, astronauts have a really complex water system. It squeezes every last drop of safe and available liquid out of the environment. This involves recycling used water. It means that our buddies in space drink water that's been filtered from old shower water, their breath, the spaceship's fuel cells, sweat, and so on. But don't worry, such water is safe to drink, and it's actually even better than most drinking water that comes out of taps in the US. The water on a spacecraft first goes through a bunch of filters, starting with one that removes particles and debris. Then it passes through multi-filtration beds, containing clever substances that remove impurities. The final stage gets rid of harmful compounds and destroys nasty bacteria and viruses. There are also water reserves in case of emergency. For example, the International Space Station keeps around 530 gallons of water in its reserves, just in case. But what about the air supply? The primary source of oxygen on spacecraft comes from something called water electrolysis. This is an amazing system that uses electricity from the craft's solar panels to split water into hydrogen and oxygen gas. But as we saw with NASA's Dawn, without electricity, it's pretty difficult to aim the solar panels at the sun, which means that the oxygen system would likely shut down. There is some oxygen stored in a pressurized storage tank, though. This is a backup supply designed for emergencies, so it's not all bad news.
April 12th, in the year 2212. It's a great date for humanity, the 300th anniversary of the launch of the legendary Titanic. The best engineers of the world have collaborated for years to bring their masterpiece to the public, the Space Titanic, and they've done it just in time. The glorious spaceship is waiting in its harbor under the limelight, photographed by thousands of people. The trip was scheduled for April 12th, just like 300 years ago. Finally, the big day has come. The passengers are going on board the most magnificent spaceship of the time. They call it unbreachable. It has 12 decks, from the third class closer to the bottom to the most luxurious first class on the top, with panoramic views of outer space. The ship is preparing for launch. The engines are starting, the final countdown has begun, and the Space Titanic is off into the sky. It quickly becomes no more than a speck in the big blue and then disappears. The first day of the flight goes perfectly. The ship leaves the Earth's atmosphere in less than an hour, and passengers enjoy the wonderful view outside. The blue and green planet on the backdrop of the black void of space. The ship slows down a bit as it moves into orbit. There are too many satellites and space debris circling around the Earth. The Space Titanic has to go carefully and maneuver around the chunks of metal floating in zero-G. One of them heads straight towards the ship, but it turns on the side burners and moves out of the way just in time. The scrap floats by safely. Finally, the ship is out of the danger zone and into the big black. It turns on the back thrusters to accelerate and heads to the bright side of the moon. It's going to be the first destination of the sightseeing tour. The planet becomes gradually smaller behind, and about halfway to the natural satellite, people on board can marvel at the sight of the sun. The huge ball of burning plasma is bigger and brighter than ever in the cosmic darkness. Suddenly, the ship's captain makes an announcement. All passengers are invited to the promenade decks to watch as the solar panels are being unfolded. People go outside to goggle at the sight. The silver and black panels slowly emerge from their containment slots, and the Space Titanic finally takes its real form. As the sun's energy begins to flow into the ship, the thrust engines turn to minimum. The spaceship is now in energy-collecting mode. For the trip to Mars to take just a few days, it needs to make a transit jump. In another 5 hours, another announcement rings across the board. The ship is approaching the Moon, and the passengers are invited to look at the satellite from up close. The Space Titanic passes by at several thousand miles, and the Moon looks huge. All the craters on the satellite, even the smallest ones, are clearly visible. The view is outstanding. The Moon is left behind, and lights on the ship go dim. There's no natural change of day and night in space, so the crew monitors the time and imitates the shift. The next day promises nothing of interest, as there's going to be a long traverse between the Moon and Mars. The passengers are wandering off to their cabins to sleep. The next 2 days go uneventful. On the decks, there are numerous types of entertainment for guests. From gyms and swimming pools to game rooms and dancing halls. People wander around the promenade decks, enjoying the serene views of space. Nothing bodes trouble. On the 4th day, the captain finally announces that the Space Titanic is preparing for the transit jump in 30 minutes. When the time comes, the passengers only feel a slight tug as the huge vessel leaps through space-time, entering the vicinity of Mars. Many passengers go outside to look at the red planet, which is already visible in the dark abyss. The tour is entering its final stage, but the landing is only planned for late night. At 11 p.m., when most passengers were already in their beds, the Space Titanic begins the final maneuvers. It has to make a little roundabout trip over Mars because the port is on the other side of the planet. The flight is nearing its end, only a couple of hours left before landing. The ship is in the orbit on the far side of Mars. Everything's quiet. Too quiet. All of a sudden, an enormous boom thrashes the whole Space Titanic, throwing sleeping people out of their beds. Blinking emergency lights turn on. Everyone's confused, but no announcement comes from the captain. And only those who have been on the starboard side promenade deck notice the horrible detail. The right front wing has been torn off and is zooming past them towards the stern. Pressing their faces to the glass, straining to look at the hull, they see a huge gash near the nose of the ship. The Space Titanic shudders again, and chunks of metal fly out of the gaping hole. The ship rapidly loses pressurization. Meanwhile, the broken-off wing hit the stern and left another gash in it. Mechanisms in the engine compartment start to fall apart and are dragged into space. The ship groans and comes to a halt, suspended thousands of miles above Mars. At last, the captain announces through the intercom that the Space Titanic has unexpectedly collided with a rogue asteroid. All passengers are asked to proceed to their respective decks for evacuation. Within an hour, all rescue capsules are occupied and ready to be deployed. But about a third of the passengers are still on board the ship. It turns out many of the capsules were blown away at the collision. History seems to repeat itself. The captain still orders to deploy the capsules, and they whoosh out of containment tanks, leaving hundreds of people behind. Some left without their family members, not knowing what fate awaits them. The capsules float in space for a few seconds and then turn on their thrust engines, heading to the Martian surface. Another order from the captain. Everyone is to go down to their cabins and put on pressurized suits stored under their beds. As the passengers rush to comply, the Space Titanic sends distress signals to Mars and everyone in the vicinity. 100,000 miles away, a large trade ship, Leona, picks up the signal and hurries to help. The creaks and groans on board the Space Titanic become more and more frantic. People are sitting silently in their cabins. It's quiet on board, except for the sounds of the slowly disintegrating ship. And then, suddenly, a loud snap resonates throughout the Space Titanic. and the vessel cracks in two. A gigantic fracture goes from top to bottom almost perfectly halfway across the decks. Pressurized glass covering the promenade decks shatter into millions of pieces, slowly flying away from the ship. With the decks depressurized, people and things are blown away into outer space. Thankfully, all of the passengers and crew are wearing their suits as ordered, but they only have about an hour before they run out of oxygen. People help each other by floating together and hauling stranded ones to their groups. They can barely control their floating, but somehow they still manage to bring some order to the chaos. Huddled together in orbit above the ominously red planet, they watch as the mighty Space Titanic turns into a heaping pile of space debris. 45 minutes have passed. The oxygen is running low, and people try to breathe as slowly and carefully as they can. There's still no help in sight, and they're preparing for the worst. But then, one of them starts waving and pointing somewhere. It's a bright spot, hardly different from the stars in far space, but it's getting closer by the second. And within 5 minutes, the relieved people see a spaceship speeding towards them. The Leonas arrive just in time to save the day. Quickly, but without hurry, Leona's crew gather everyone floating in space around the remains of the Space Titanic and haul them on board their ship. In a few hours, the Leona safely lands at Mars' main spaceport. The newspapers called it the day when the Titanic sank again.